Somewhere between 1978 and today, a quiet experiment happened on a massive scale. Millions of teenagers were pulled out of the workforce, and almost nobody talks about what that experiment did to their minds. In the late 70s, more than half of American teenagers held a summer job. Today, that number has fallen below 1 in 3. We tend to talk about this as an economic story, a footnote about changing labor markets or stricter school schedules. But it isn't really an economic story at all. It's a psychological one. Because that part-time job, the one behind the fast food counter or the grocery store register, wasn't just a way to make a few extra dollars. It was a training ground for the adolescent brain, and when we quietly removed it, we removed something far more important than income. Let's start with a simple idea from psychology called stress inoculation. The theory goes like this: just as your immune system needs exposure to small amounts of pathogens to build real immunity, your nervous system needs exposure to small amounts of real-world stress to build real resilience. A tough boss. An impatient customer. A shift that runs long. None of these things are dangerous. But they are uncomfortable, and that discomfort, experienced early and in manageable doses, teaches a developing brain something it can't learn any other way. It teaches the brain that discomfort is survivable, that you can be yelled at, or embarrassed, or exhausted, and still show up the next day and function. Without that early inoculation, the first real dose of adult-sized stress doesn't land at 16 behind a cash register. It lands later, often in a person's 20s, when the stakes are dramatically higher and the margin for error is much smaller. So what actually happened to that first job? Where did it go? Mostly, it got replaced. Not by nothing, but by something that looks productive on the surface and functions very differently underneath. Teenagers didn't trade work for leisure. They traded work for a hyper-structured performance economy built entirely around institutional approval. Grades. Standardized test scores. Extracurricular resumes built for college admissions. On paper, this looks like more discipline, not less. These are ambitious, hard-working kids. But the psychological engine driving that hard work is completely different from the one that drives a kid folding shirts for $8 an hour. Here's the distinction, and it matters more than it sounds like it should. Psychologist Albert Bandura built much of his career around a concept called self-efficacy, the belief that your own actions can produce results in the world. A part-time job delivers this belief in the most concrete way imaginable. You work 6 hours, you get a paycheck, the math is simple and undeniable. I did the work, and the world responded. That feedback loop builds what's called an internal locus of control, a deep-seated sense that your effort is the thing steering your life. Grades and test scores, by contrast, are judged. They are handed down by an authority figure using criteria a teenager doesn't fully control and often doesn't fully understand. The effort is still real, the hours are still long, but the psychological experience is one of performing for approval rather than generating results. One builds a young person who believes in their own agency. The other, especially when it becomes the only game in town, quietly builds a young person who has learned to seek external validation instead of trusting their own judgment. Now let's bring in the brain chemistry, because this part explains something a lot of parents have noticed but couldn't quite name. Teenagers today aren't lazy. Anyone who's watched a 15-year-old grind through an 8-hour gaming session or spend hours perfecting a video edit knows that focus and effort are not the problem. The problem is what psychologists call the friction gradient. A phone offers something no part-time job ever could: high reward, delivered instantly, for almost no physical or emotional effort. Every scroll, every notification, every match in a game is a small, fast hit of dopamine with essentially zero friction attached. Now compare that to restocking a shelf for 2 hours, or standing at a register while a stranger complains about a return policy. Low dopamine, high friction, and a payoff that doesn't arrive until the end of a long, boring shift. Given a straight choice between these two experiences, the adolescent brain, wired for immediate reward, will gravitate toward the frictionless option every single time. That's not a character flaw. That's basic neuroscience. But it means an entire generation is spending its most neuroplastic years training almost exclusively in the low-friction, high-reward environment, and getting very little practice in the other kind. And the ability to push through boredom, to tolerate delayed reward, to keep going when a task offers no instant payoff, that ability is a muscle. Like any muscle, it atrophies without use. There's a second cost here that's easy to miss, and it has nothing to do with money at all. It's about who teenagers actually talk to. A modern teenager's social world is remarkably curated. Online interactions are shaped by algorithms that show them more of what they already like. Offline interactions are often structured by adults, through school clubs, organized sports, supervised activities. Almost everyone a teenager encounters in a given week is either handpicked by a platform or approved by a parent. Compare that to a job. A part-time job throws a 16-year-old into a room with people they never would have chosen and never would have met otherwise. A 50-year-old shift manager with 3 kids and a mortgage. A coworker twice their age working a second job to make rent. A customer having the worst day of their week and taking it out on whoever's behind the counter. None of that is comfortable. All of it is valuable. It functions as a kind of accidental exposure therapy, forcing young people to navigate real social friction with real strangers, developing the exact skill set that later gets called emotional intelligence or people skills. Remove that environment, and you remove the low-stakes practice ground where those skills used to develop almost by accident. And this brings us to maybe the most important idea in this whole story, the difference between low-stakes failure and high-stakes failure. Getting fired from a summer job at 16 is, in the grand scheme of a life, almost nothing. It stings for a week. Maybe there's an awkward conversation with a parent. But nobody's future collapses because a teenager got let go from a part-time job. It's a safe place to fail, to learn what failure actually feels like, and to discover the genuinely useful fact that failure is survivable. Now consider what's replaced it as the primary site of adolescent stress. A rejection letter from a dream college. A single bad score on an exam that feels like it determines an entire future. These are not low-stakes environments. They are high stakes, and for a lot of teenagers, they now function as the very first real experience of failure they've ever had. Which means the first time many young people learn that failure is survivable, they're learning it under conditions where the emotional stakes feel enormous. That is, developmentally, exactly backwards. The lesson that setbacks are survivable is supposed to get installed early, cheaply, and repeatedly, in situations too small to do lasting damage. Instead, for a lot of today's teenagers, that lesson is arriving late, expensive, and all at once. Step back and look at the whole picture, and a pattern starts to emerge. This isn't really a story about summer jobs disappearing. It's a story about training wheels being quietly removed from adolescents, one at a time, without anyone deciding to remove them on purpose. Nobody sat down and decided that teenagers should stop practicing autonomy, stop practicing resilience, stop practicing low-stakes social friction. It happened gradually, as schedules filled up with academics, as competition for college admissions intensified, as digital entertainment became more available and more engineered for engagement, and as parents, often with the best intentions, tried to protect their kids from exactly the kind of friction that used to build them. The result is a generation that is, in many ways, more supervised, more accomplished on paper, and more anxious than the ones that came before it. And a lot of researchers now believe those 3 things are connected. So where does that leave things? It's worth asking, honestly, what it would look like to rebuild some of what got lost, not by turning back the clock, but by finding new versions of the same experience. Some kind of low-stakes, real-world responsibility. Some kind of interaction with people outside a chosen circle. Some kind of activity where effort and outcome are directly, undeniably connected, the way a paycheck used to connect them. It doesn't have to be a part-time job specifically. It has to be something that puts a young person in a room with real friction and lets them discover, on their own, that they can handle it, because in the end, that was always the real value of that first job behind the counter. It was never really about the money in the envelope. It was about the quiet, repeated proof that a person can face something uncomfortable, get through it, and come out the other side a little more capable than they were before. That's the kind of lesson that used to get taught by accident, every single shift. And figuring out how to teach it again, on purpose, might be one of the more important questions of raising the next generation.